are these people?
Speaking of, I brought this story to the table, which is from Pop Resistance, and specifically by Fight Back News, and they are talking about in Chicago, like a couple of movements together forced the release of some Chicago police torture survivors that are like legit survivors and been proven to be so pretty much. This is like CFIST and the NAARPR, right? The National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, and the Campaign to Free. It probably tells me right here. I hope. Where is it? The Campaign to Free Incarcerated Survivors of Police Torture. Those people. So it's not going back, is it? Why? There we go. So, in Chicago, Illinois, a series of victories was won in the past month by the movement to free survivors of fortune and wrongful conviction at the hands of Chicago Police Department Claiborne Smith, Marcellus Pittman, Juan Hernandez, and Rosendo Hernandez, Arthur Almendarez, John Galvin, Arubia Abrigo, Jeremiah Kane, David Gecht, and David Collin have all had historic judgments in their cases. So, in the case of Claiborne Smith, a decision of the Illinois Appellate Court, authored by Justice Cynthia Cobbs, reversed the decision of Circuit Court Judge Alfredo Maldonado. Jesus, I forget it's Chicago. It's all half Italians, right? Finding the detectives Kenneth Boudreaux. How'd Boudreaux get there? John Halloran and James O'Brien had tortured Claiborne Smith into his confessions. They granted him a new trial. So essentially, they got him to confess to something he didn't do.
Right.
Through torture.
Right.
In case anyone was wondering. In turn, Judge Maldonado found in the cases of Marcellus Pittman that his tortured confessions at the hands of Halloran and O'Brien was inadmissible. Marcellus Pittman also had the charges against him dropped by the state attorney's office within the written decisions by each of these judges. It was laid out plainly that these detectives with a history of torture are not credible and should not be called as witnesses. Justice Cynthia Cobbs in the Claiborne Smith case stated in her decision, the defendant has produced sufficient evidence of a pattern of physical abuse by the detectives in question, returning to Detectives Boudreaux, Halloran, and O'Brien. And Judge Roberto Maldonado stated in his decision in the Marcellus Pittman case that his ruling called into question the credibility of Halloran and O'Brien's denials. These decisions come after years of campaigning by the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression's campaign for free incarcerated survivors of police torture, mothers activating movements for abolition and solidarity, and the Chicago Torture Justice Center to free survivors of police torture and wrongful convictions and hold torturing officers accountable. In October 2021, the CAARPR began to pressure the Cook County State Attorney offices, the CCSAO, to take action on 409 cases of torture and wrongful convictions. I'll read that again for the people in the back. 490 cases of torture and wrongful convictions. That's a lot of torture. So detailed in a comprehensive report that can be found on the Chicago Alliance website. So you can go look that up if you wish. The CAARPR presented the CCSAO with 9 demands. These included that their office move to vacate convictions for all those framed, tortured, and wrongfully convicted, especially in cases involving detectives with a pattern and practice of torture, that cases involving John Burge's Midnight Crew, of which Boudreaux, Halloran, and O'Brien were a part. be reviewed and the related convictions vacated, and that the CCSAO publicly state that they will cease calling detectives with established records of torture as witnesses. These recent rulings directly reflect the campaign's demands. Another demand of the campaign was for the CCSAO to provide information on the status of their promised comprehensive review of Guevara's cases, rapidly complete the review, and vacate all convictions. And when detectives Ronaldo Guevara, Joseph, you want to try that one? Miedzinianowicz? No, the next one. Try the next one.
Oh. No.
See, people, this is difficult. I'm going to go with Miedzinianowicz.
Ski is the last part.
Yeah.
That's all I could say.
Miedziniowski. Anyway.
Okay.
Or Ronald Watts were involved. So those detectives. I imagine this guy goes as Joe M. Right? Because no one could pronounce his last name. Officer, sure. Detective Joe M. Ronaldo Guevara is a former homicide detective who secured dozens of convictions by framing mostly Puerto Rican and black young people. According to the report, over 50 individuals have accused him of coercing confessions through physical or psychological torture or through manipulating witnesses to obtain convictions. Many of them were juveniles at the time of the arrest. Thoughts so far, Collin? Like,
I mean, well, this is Chicago PD, so aren't they notorious for doing like shady shit anyway?
Yes. Yeah.
But I think the idea, like, you know, they were torturing people who didn't commit any crimes, basically. You know, like, only for now. Like, I didn't read this article, but like, do you know how long they were locked in jail for?
I think one of the guys was like a year or so, right? Like it was fairly fresh. I think it might say in the rest of the article. But I mean, it's 409 convictions of like torture by these assholes. Like, how many lives were ruined by that?
Right.
You know?
But I think it's just the idea of, and I think it's not surprising considering, you know, like what we've seen, you know, within the last 3 years, you know, with cops, you know, it's basically the way that they, you know, arrest people or, you know, like try to handle, you know, especially Black people in terms of justice is, I wouldn't necessarily call it torture, but, you know, you can kind of equivocate it to this.
Yeah.
You know, it's the idea of like, you know, like a person's running away, then cops feel like, oh, okay, you know, unarmed, like cops feel it's okay, you know, to shoot them dead, you know, like, you know, person like, you know, coming out of a car, you know, obviously not trying to start any mess, and then cops feel like, oh, it's okay for me to rough you up to the
escalate
point where, like,
and
to the point where like you get seriously hurt, you know, like, you know, you're trying to bring in people who obviously didn't commit crimes, so you're going to torture them so that they will just kind of give in. You know, so I think this is just kind of the whole idea, just as far as the police system, you know, in this country in general, is just basically all fucked up. But it's not designed, you know, it's not really designed for just, at least for the working class, at least. This just kind of shows like, you know, more so like if you're within the working class, you know, under the cops, you know, especially if you're a person of color, then you really aren't worth shit. So, so it's not surprising, but I think especially given that it's Chicago, definitely not surprising at all.
Fucking Chicago. Like, yeah, this is like fucking old mob fucking, like, anyway, you know, This is like classic crooked cop. I mean, you're welcome to ask the Hardlands media people, and Elias, who also lives in Chicago, how the, Chicago PD operate.
Right.
But yeah, it's just funny that this is, I'm wondering what the precedent will be going further, right? Like in other places, if this could be used, if you can prove that there was counts of torture,
Right.
like, which I'm sure is not that hard. In all honesty.
But I think in this story, the positive in this is that people had to organize in order to turn this around. So it
Yes.
wasn't done by government or politicians. This was done by regular people, So I think it's just kind of showing like if organizations in coalitions can come together, to fight a greater good, then, then that could be more if it's worth in gold versus, waiting for a politician to do something. So,
Yeah.
so I think even in the midst of the shit within the story, that's the one positive thing that
Well,
it's
I'm sure.
the situation turned around not for because anyone in government made them happen. It was through basically direct action through
Yeah,
the
these
working class that made
organizations.
this happen.
Right. And I hope more places like that. I hope this isn't just a regional thing to Chicago. I hope there's more organizations that work on things like that out there
Right.
to support. But so the Cook County judge, Obish, said Guevara has now eliminated the possibility of being considered a credible witness in any proceeding due to the evidence against him and his refusal to testify. This is a judgment that is now being applied to other torture cops such as Boudreaux, Halloran, and O'Brien. So the leading force behind the effort to free survivors of Detective Guevara has been the organization Innocent Demand Justice, IDJ, which is led by Guevara survivors themselves, as well as family members like Esther Hernandez, who has been fighting for the freedom of her two sons, Juan Pucci Hernandez and Rosendo Hernandez, since their wrongful imprisonment in 1997. Along MAMAS and the CAARPR and the CTJC IDJ mobilized rallies for court dates, hosted phone zaps, pressured elected officials, met with state attorney's office, researched Guevara thoroughly, and spoke out in the media. These organizations demanded justice for all of Guevara's victims, meaning immediate release, charges against Guevara, and reparations for those tortured.
Wow.
I mean, like, I'm digging the energy here. On Friday, July 15th, the Hernandez brothers were released with all charges dropped against them. This came as part of a wave of exonerations of Guevara's survivors, including Ruby Abrigo, Jeremiah Kane, David Collin, and David Gecht. The release of these survivors and the decisions by the state attorney's office to not retry them for these baseless charges are a result of the movement to free torture survivors and the wrongfully convicted. Esther Hernandez responding to her son's release saying, "I can't even explain how I feel right now. I'm so joyful," she added. "As I come to these other cases, I see them come home. I'm like, oh my God, our day is coming. I get happy every time I see somebody come out, an innocent man coming out of prison." I mean, more of this, please.
Yeah, more of this. But yeah, as I said, like, it's a shitty story, but at least it has a good outcome.
Yeah.
But that only came about from working people coming together. And, like, this is organizing what it looks like. Like, you can make the argument whether this is mobilization or organization, but it sounds like here, there are steps. I think moving forward, this can be potentially something, I think kind of building off what you were saying, like, that doesn't just stop, or at least it's not just a regional thing, in terms of this just happening in Chicago. Like, ideally, what should be happening is like this can spread, more across the country, because it's not just Chicago where there's crooked cops, especially, and I'm sure there's like other cities, that cops are doing something like this, but it's not necessarily being reported on.
Yeah.
So it's kind of sad that we have to get the story from independent, news stories, and hasn't been mentioned at all in the mainstream media.
No.
Like, we know why, but surprise, surprise.
I'd love to see Hardlands, which I'll send them this article and stuff after this, but I'm sure Ed Heller, who will be in the chat later if he's not now, if you guys can reach out to any of these people for us, I would appreciate it for follow up. That would be nice.
Yeah, but
any of those organizations,
as far as the organization that around this, that and it sounds like basically most of the people who were involved were people of color. So so the idea that people got together in their different organizational groups, banded together, and really worked to ensure that their families were out, got out of jail, but I feel along with that, there should be like retribution for the cops as well. Like, I think that's the only thing that was missing in your article, is like, what will happen to these cops, So, so I think, honestly, like, I would love to know, more of what happened with this, but I think this should be, oh, you had more to this slide?
There's a little bit. I just wanted to stop on that because, Jesus. In addition to survivors of Boudreaux, Halloran, O'Brien, and Guevara being released, 2 survivors of Detective Victor Switsky and John Hannaran were released the following day. John Galvin and Arthur Almendarez were wrongfully convicted in 1986. 1986! So you were asking how long some of these people have been in here for? There's one of them. How long's that? 1986 to now?
That's over 25 years.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Okay. After Hannaran and Switsky tortured them into signing...
More than that. More than that, actually.
Oh, that's even worse.
Yeah.
Into signing confessions, statements to a crime they didn't commit, the detectives told them that they would be able to go home after signing these confessions. They made many attempts to file motions for their witness confessions to be suppressed and quash the arrest. They were sentenced for life without parole, with Galvin being sent to Stateville and Almendarez to Hill prisons. New evidence emerged of police coercion, and after 35 years, their case was finally vacated by a Cook County judge. 35 years. They were sentenced to life without parole.
For a crime they didn't commit.
Oh, Jesus. What the fuck is wrong with Chicago?
Well, not the fuck is wrong with Chicago. What the fuck is wrong
America?
With America.
Everywhere.
Yeah, this is not limited to just Chicago. This is America. So I don't know.
Yeah.
So I think, just like I said, this gives more, and I think we've talked about this, I think especially, with indie, like, we want to highlight, stories where people are organizing and getting together and trying to make change, so, so I think obviously the rest of the stories that we're covering tonight, do kind of reflect some of that. But I think, again, this is just like, I think this should be an encouragement to people who are watching, that, because it can be disheartening sometimes to organize, especially when people are, against you, for certain things, or kind of, minimize what you're trying to do. But I think this is the idea of, like, one, you can't do this work by yourself. You have to do this type of organization with other people who, share your vision as well, but also just the understanding of what you're going to go up against. I'm pretty sure that these people kind of knew, and that they had to really kind of plan and strategize, what the next steps would be. But it didn't stop. The idea that they were at this for, by the sound of it, over 30 years. Like, I think it's crazy, but at the same time, it just shows, when you're organizing, you have to be willing to, and I've said this before on the show, like you have to be willing to possibly give up your life
Yeah.
in order to see justice,
Um,
in whatever you're seeking to be better.
So, in addition to survivors of Boudreaux, Halloran, O'Brien, and Guevara being released, two survivors. We read that one. Sorry.
Yeah.
So detectives Hannaran and Switsky were also mentioned in the CAA RPR's CFIST report, and the pattern and practice of torture within the Chicago Police Department. The CFIST report not only clearly demonstrates a long pattern of abuse by crooked officers, but how innocent lives will continue to be lost and harmed, the victims and their families. The long pattern of abuse will not stop unless community control of the police is established and all wrongfully convicted prisoners are given immediate release, said Kobe Gullery at a rally outside the Cook County Jail in response to this wave of decisions. These victories in the campaign to free incarcerated survivors of police torture and wrongful conviction are a sign that the powers that be are responding to the demands of the survivors, families, and activists who continue the fight for justice. So,
Basically,
yeah, I mean,
defund the police.
Yes. Yep.
Just a very subtle way of saying defund the police.
Yeah.
So,
and also the that the community has to be a part of policing them,
right. Well, you see that generally in affluent neighborhoods. Generally, the police that generally police there, not always, but usually live in those neighborhoods, know the people within those neighborhoods, and they're just kind of a part of the fabric, within those neighborhoods. That's not necessarily the case in low income, so they're not, they're not part of the neighborhood. They're outsiders within the neighborhood. They don't know the situations of why people do certain things or the makeup of the neighborhood. So there's a lot of distrust, to begin with. But the idea that a lot of these cops have a chip on their shoulder, as far as, essentially beating, people who they feel like are in the wrong, and because of their power, they can just do whatever they want to the detriment of people and families, in the name of, policing, I think, it's just very wrong. But as I said, this just shows, the power of organization, what it can do, and how, I have to say from Kwame Ture, organization is eternal, so in this case, I'm sure they're going to, hopefully they continue to organize, around this issue, and I hope it expands, outside of Chicago too. But as I said, it's just interesting how we have to find this in media, independent news, and this is not necessarily shared, in mainstream, especially given what's been happening that mainstream media does cover, they're not necessarily countering with stories like this that shows the power of organizing, which I'm sure that's probably why that mainstream media is not going to cover a story like this, because we don't want to give people ideas of what they can do,
Right.
and also it just shows you don't need a politician to do the work for you.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. But shout out to Indie News. If you look up his website, which is in the descriptions below, if you look at that Indie News network, but Indie Left's websites, which we get almost all of our stories from, compiled there for you, including this one, which nice of people to have, that outlet there, and him compiling some of the best stories out there, in my opinion. But yeah, at least, people are getting out from this. That's my only,
yeah.
There's
power lies within us, friends.
Yeah. As Jesse Jett would like to tell us.
Right.
But anyway, someone said in the chat that Or was it that they hadn't seen any updates for the ASP? What is it? The ASPS, right? And the FBI. Yeah, I haven't seen any updates of the African Socialist Party's offices, homes. Yep, we're gonna have a bit of that. I also wanted to shout out Anna Mayers on the Rockfin, tipped us $10. Appreciate that. I seriously can't with the hopium about M4A anymore. Sure, other countries didn't kill their citizens like America did by treating every illness as for-profit commodity or tie their jobs to the ability to see the white coat big pharma pushers, but how short-sighted are we? Did we not see medical tyranny tested in real time? Did people not lose their jobs if they're refused an experimental drug? Yeah, I think my thing is like, I definitely wouldn't trust this government too. That's usually my response. You know, if like Collin was running it, maybe, you know, like, but smart people aren't going to be running that right now. So, but anyway,
smart people who don't have an agenda.
Yes. And also make sure that the certain limitations and also, you know, like exemptions are made. Like you just need doctors that actually know what they're talking about. But anyway,